For the second part of chapter one, we're going to talk about other things going on in world history. We talked about how the first peoples, the natives, Native Americans, or really first peoples, came to the Americas all throughout North America, all the way down to the southern tip of South America. We talked about the three major foodstuffs that came from the Central Valley of Mexico: corn, beans, and squash. We talked about the potato and its development in modern day Peru, basically, and how uh, crops like that helped establish sedentary societies that could now establish civilization. You don't have to go chase your food. But then we also talked about Native Americans that were in every corner of what would become the United States, the Cahokia peoples, mound builders out east. You have your American Plains natives, the Sioux, and others around places like the Dakotas, Nebraska, following and chasing buffalo wherever they went. You had the Pueblo peoples in the American Southwest, modern day Arizona, New Mexico, places like that, that relied very heavily on irrigation to subsist and building domiciles in the side of a hill or a mountain to give shade. And then, of course, in the Pacific Northwest, you had your peoples who ate a bunch of big fish and game in that region, whether from the North Pacific Ocean or from the Snake and Columbia rivers, elk, moose, things along those lines. We talked about some civilizations that also existed in West Africa, but one of the biggest things that was happening at that time was in Europe itself. Europe was at a very big point of influx for several different reasons. So, as we go into chapter one's second half, let's share our screen so that we can see exactly what I'm talking about, and therefore move on to part two of chapter one. So, what was going on in Europe at the time of exploration and whatnot? While all of this was being built in the 1300s or so, 1400s, what was all going on across the Atlantic Ocean? And so, politics in Western Europe had been dominated by old European fiefdoms. You had your royals, your nobles, and then everybody else, where you basically had your old serfdoms and fiefdoms to where you had people that lorded over you, kind of in a system that limited freedom. It limited the ability to purchase land or to really ascend or to seek education. And as such, there was a lot of competition for resources in Europe as it was, and there was not as much to go around. And if you look at a heat map of conflict all throughout the world in world history, every corner of the world where humans have existed, there's been conflict. Maybe a little less in places like Australia or anything else like that, but even there, Aboriginals engaged in conflict. But every corner of the world where humans have existed, there's been conflict. Europe, in particular, glows red hot. And the last several thousand years in Europe, you have an awful lot of competition for European resources, fervor for which also exacerbated by old empires. Roman Empire, the breakup thereof, Holy Roman Empire, the Visigoths, the you name it, the Vikings, Ottomans, the Slavs, you name it. All throughout Europe, there's been competition for resources over the centuries. And in such, it has shaped a European view that coincided with a time in American and really world history that changed human trajectory. And as such, in the 13 and early 1400s, Europe itself was in the midst of the bubonic plague. I mean, we think of COVID a few years ago as just being terrible. COVID is actually, if you're in reasonable health, COVID's just fine for most of you. And we know that today. But in the 1400s, the bubonic plague, before the advent of medicines that could easily fix it, if you got the plague, Black Death as it was often called, there was an extremely high likelihood that you're going to die, and in reasonably short order. Nowadays, with the advent of penicillin and other antibiotics and other different things, uh, if you were to get something like bubonic plague, take this medication and you'd be just fine in a matter of days. Every now and then, the plague is diagnosed in very random instances across places across the world. And it's really just kind of, wow, you wouldn't think that would happen anymore. They can cure it. Here's your penicillin or whichever antibiotic, and you're perfectly fine after a few days, and no harm, no foul. Nobody's worse for the wear. But back then, it was massive. And in the 1300s, Europe lost veritably half of its entire population due to the bubonic plague. And that caused a lot of governments, which had already been semi-fiefdoms in those places. You have theocracies, you have other forms of government controlled by hierarchies. Nowadays, when there are fewer people to go around, governments then become even more hierarchical and centralized, whether it's spearheaded by a king or otherwise. And so, from that standpoint, Europe is in flux after the war. And then eventually, Europe repopulates, and the competition for resources continues to exacerbate, especially now that you have governments and fiefdoms and kingdoms, spiritual or otherwise, that compete for ideology, resources, and whatever land is available. So Europeans oftentimes volunteer for military service or whatnot, but really, you think about some of the discussion of patriarchy today and the common criticisms of patriarchy that exist today in certain movements. They come from hundreds of years ago. And patriarchy in a European mindset based on Christian law, Christian values, really lends more heavily from a legal and familial standpoint unto men. Okay. So when all of these things from a political standpoint are merging together in Europe, it's going to shape European worldview. Now, in Western Europe, you have various different phenomena. You have a mix of Middle Eastern cultures, North African cultures, Visigoths, Viking, Slavic, all kinds of people merged together. And in a competition for resources, you might actually live in a kingdom that has the same religion as the kingdom next to you. You might perhaps both be Catholic, but that doesn't mean that you're friends, because there is such a thing as nationality as opposed to spirituality. And so, from that standpoint, maybe perhaps in Europe, you're going to compete for resources. And another thing, if you have noticed, a lot of times European foods don't always taste the very best or whatnot. I like to think Swedish food is just kind of gross. I've seen Swedish food and it's just not me, not me. Um, I grew up on Tex-Mex food, and I love all kinds of different things that have more flavor. So, but also not just that, different types of food stuffs that can become more readily available could be traded. Different types of vegetables, not just spices that make your foods taste better. So, Europeans at the time were fighting for resources to improve their foodstuffs, to also gain more territory and perhaps new converts. And for one European country in particular, things were especially fervent from a religious standpoint. But economy, the European economy made it to where, in combination with various different flat earther ideals, they believed that by sailing west from Europe, you'd fall off the earth. We know that's factually not true. The earth is a globe, it's a sphere. You're just going to circumvent, but otherwise, so they didn't know that at the time. And so it was believed that the proper and real way to get from places like Portugal to India would be to go around Africa. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. But otherwise, so various different seafaring communities, opportunities, and cultures really developed and became ingrained in this time period. Let's look at religion. Europe at this time is very predominantly Christian. as having had been inspired by the Roman Empire, Eastern Byzantine Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, others, and other groups that had adopted Christianity. And at the time, the only Christian church was the Catholic Church. That's the OG Christian church, the Roman Catholic Church. Now, yes, there was a split between Eastern and Western Christianity. That's why you have all your Orthodox churches. But from the purpose of Western Christianity, the Roman Catholic Church is where it all started. It's actually where it all started, Orthodox or otherwise. So, from that standpoint, Catholicism was a de facto religion if you're in Europe. And that was all that existed at the time. So, Christianity dominated almost every aspect of European society, except one place in particular, and that's in the Iberian Peninsula, modern day Spain and Portugal. So, Spain, as you know today in the Iberian Peninsula, had once been a part of the Roman Empire. They spoke Latin, they had Roman provisional and viceroyal entities, and quite a number of those who inhabited what is modern day Spain would serve in the Roman military and conquest and that sort of a thing. So Spain at one point had been a very strong aspect of the Roman Empire. Spain is also where Rome fought many of its battles against Carthage across the Mediterranean back in the day. So Spain was definitely interesting. Spain, after about the year 700 or so, had begun to see incursions from Moorish peoples from North Africa. The Moors, who were predominantly North African Muslims, had eventually overtaken the modern Iberian Peninsula and established a caliphate there. And for the better part of 700 or so years, the Iberian Peninsula, modern day Portugal and Spain, had been controlled by the Moors, and they established Islam as the predominant religion there under their caliphate rule. Not every inch of the Iberian Peninsula was conquered by the Moors, though. And over the centuries, you had small Christian kingdoms in the northern part of Spain that would merge together and vow to eventually re Christianize the Iberian Peninsula. So, over the course of several hundred years, upon mergers and mergers, eventually the Moors would be driven out of modern day Spain. And as such, religious fervor to re Christianize the Iberian Peninsula was at its peak. So, not only was the majority of Europe Christian, Spain in particular wanted to reconquer the Iberian Peninsula, drive out the Moors, and re Christianize the peninsula. To where if you were not already Christian, you were told you were either going to leave or you're going to convert. If you're Jewish, in rare instances, you might be allowed to stay Jewish, but really, you were extremely encouraged to convert to Catholicism. If you were Muslim, same thing. Your name will no longer be Muhammad, your name will now be Juan. You are going to convert, change, and you are no longer going to pray on your knees facing various orientations in a mosque. You're now going to go to Mass at a Catholic church, and you're going to sing the prayers of the Lord Jesus Christ. And that was Spanish fervor at the time. And the fervor for conversion to Christianity extended not just to Jews and Muslims. Christians were often questioned, how good of a Christian are you? Are you going to Mass every Sunday? Are you observing this religious holiday? Did you say your prayers correctly? Are you tithing quite the same way? Are you doing certain things to prove that you are a good and observant Christian? And in Spain at the time, you have what's known as the Spanish Inquisition. And this is where you basically have theocratic police, if you will, that would force conversions among Jews and Muslims, ask them how they have renamed themselves, ask them about the things that they're learning in biblical teachings. And other Christians would also be asked as well, how good of a Christian are you? That fervor for Christianity was inspired largely as the Spanish kingdoms drove out the Moors that had been there for 700 years. And it finally coincided when the kingdom of Aragon merged with the kingdom of Castile. That merger of those two kingdoms in north and central Spain is the background for the country of Spain that you know today. And eventually, other kingdoms across the peninsula would merge. Portugal had been under a different kingdom, which had once been part of a Spanish kingdom, but then they kind of split and did their own thing. Never confuse Portuguese people with Spaniards. They're on the same peninsula. They speak a very similar language, but they're not the same. Right, Portuguese? Otherwise, though, um, Spain under the new kingdoms was very fervent in their Christian views, militant about it to a very large extent. And it shaped so much of their worldview. How good of a Christian are you? If you're Muslim, you're either out or you're going to convert. Jews, same thing. Maybe in rare instances, you'd be allowed to stay Jewish, but you were highly encouraged to convert. So, from all of this standpoint, that fervor for religion is what drives and drives Spanish outlook. They also saw at the time other Europeans competing for resources across the world. And so, if you can find new people to Christianize and convert, all the better. If you can find better sea routes that might mean access to better foodstuffs, whether from a nutritional or a taste value, all the better. And what if there are other things that you might be able to obtain? Maybe more than just foodstuffs. Maybe you could also make a name for yourself. So a lot of Europeans around this time believed that they can do just that. They had some problems. A lot of these European countries don't really have much of a naval seafaring culture. And that's where Portugal comes into play. Because right here, this is the Iberian Peninsula where Spain and Portugal are located. Portugal has Portugal's not a very big country, okay? But it has a broad Atlantic coastline. And the ocean and Portugal are synonymous. Portuguese culture is very heavily influenced by their relationship with the Atlantic Ocean. They pride themselves on being seafarers and navigators and being among the very best the world has ever seen. And if you go to Portugal to this day, there are references to Portugal's navigation culture very much everywhere you go. The food, museums, buildings, cultural aspects that are just standard fare in Portugal. And so the Portuguese believed, huh, maybe, just maybe, we can navigate because we know we can't go west, we'll fall off the earth, but we're going to try and get to South Asia, so maybe the Indian subcontinent, maybe over down to Southeast Asia, the Chinese coast perhaps, maybe even as far away as Japan, foreshadowing. The Portuguese believed that you would have to go around the Cape of Africa in order to do that. This is before the Suez Canal was built that connected the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea and therefore the Indian Ocean. So, from this perspective, Portuguese navigators, who were renowned for being some of the very best in world history, decided we're going to go exploring. So you have Vasco da Gama and others who would go leave from the port of Lisbon, make their way across the African coast down to the Cape. By the way, when you're on a supply ship or exploration ship, you need to resupply. The Portuguese established trading posts all throughout the coast of Africa, especially this region right here, modern day Mali, Benin, Togo, Nigeria, Ivory Coast, that would influence certain other action that we'll talk about later. Sure, you know what that is. But otherwise, the Portuguese established trading posts all throughout the African coast would make their way around the Cape of Good Hope, establish more trading posts on the southeastern portion, modern day Mozambique, and places like that, Tanzania, Kenya, making around the Horn of Africa and across the Indian Ocean to modern day India, perhaps even maybe the southern Arabian coast, but then also to the Strait of Malacca into the East Indies to modern day Southeast Asia. The Portuguese were the first to do that, and they decided they needed to go around this Horn of Africa here, or rather the Cape of Africa, up to the Horn between Madagascar and the mainland, over to India, and down about here into Southeast Asia. And in doing so, the Portuguese were not just the first to do it, they were the first to establish trade routes. They also recognized, maybe we can also proselytize to some of these people. I have friends that go to my church who are from the Indian state of Kerala, right here in southwest India, right here. A lot of them, they look as Indian as anybody else, but their names are Portuguese. And there are Portuguese colonies and a number of others around this region of India where you had Portuguese missionaries proselytized to locals. So you have a reasonable amount of Indian Christians who are either Catholic or Indian Orthodox or something else of the sort in this region of India because of Portuguese colonization and settlement. Same can be said in other different parts of the East Indies. Macau, which is now a Chinese city, but previously it had been a Portuguese colony. Even Nagasaki, Japan, one that would become infamous in American history, and we'll talk about in 1302. Nagasaki, Japan was established by Portuguese missionaries in the 1500s. So, from that standpoint, even as far away as Japan, the Portuguese would make it. And you did also have some Chinese navigators who kind of tried to do the rest. That begs the question, why would you go around the Cape and Horn of Africa to get to India when you're connected by land? Why didn't you just go from Portugal all the way up through Asia and into the Middle East over down here into India? Why didn't you just do that? And that's because there are so many different barriers, be them physical, political, or religious barriers. To go from Portugal, you'd have to go through Spain, which is your rival, France, and otherwise. There are physical barriers that make it cold once you get to the Ural Mountains over here, especially in the wintertime. You have the Ottomans, which may be diametrically opposed to your Christian beliefs, and they're not necessarily going to be friendly to your cause. Maybe they're also in competition for resources. Same thing, getting across Persia, modern day Iran, Afghanistan, you have very inhospitable territory. It is extremely treacherous to make it through the Hindu Kush on land unless you have something to really help you. And technology didn't exist by that time. And so, from that standpoint, it is very difficult to make it by land from Portugal down to India across Eurasia. It's much more feasible, especially as your navigators, to sail around Africa. And that's how that happened. And when the Portuguese did that, it opened up the floodgates for other European entities to see, maybe we can get in on this action too. Perhaps even Portugal's neighbor, the Spaniards, would get involved in that. So in 1491, the Kingdom of Spain was officially established when the Kingdom of Aragon and Castile merged. You had Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand from each kingdom merged. When they married, their kingdoms merged. Spain became the Spain that you know today. And they saw their neighbor, Portugal, circumnavigate Africa. Isabella and Ferdinand wanted in on that action. They wanted Spanish territories, trading routes, people to potentially convert to Christianity, and so on and so forth. Why should Portugal have a monopoly upon that? And so the Spaniards wanted to get in on it. They just had problems finding takers. There was a younger navigator from the city of Genoa, which is the modern country of Italy, named Christopher Columbus, or in Spanish, Cristobal Colon, as he's commonly known, um, he believed that you can, in fact, make your way from Europe across to Asia by sailing west. He did not necessarily believe the earth was flat, and he was adamant that you could make it across. There's nothing to stop you. So you could sail from Portugal, say, for example, across over here, and you're going to land in Japan or China or India or the East Indies, something like that. And when he tried to approach a number of different other European entities and kingdoms, he was almost laughed out of the halls of their royal houses every single time. The only ones who paid any sort of attention to him were Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain. And they saw their rivals, the Portuguese, get on the action. The French were starting to maybe make explorations. The Dutch, also the Spaniards' rivals, were starting to get on the action. Maybe, perhaps, we need to do something about this as well. And so they were willing to listen to Cristobal Colon, Christopher Columbus. And they said, hey, look, Columbus, we will pay as long as A, you represent the Spanish kingdom, and B, anything you find is to be considered Spanish. So, yes, fly under the Spanish flag and you will go from there. So in 1492, that's what happened. Ironically, he left out of the port of Lisbon, which is in Portugal, under the Spanish flag, which is always kind of ironic to me. And he made his way west, believing that he would reach India itself, or maybe the East Indies, or somewhere along those lines that could prove to be a better and quicker trade route. They did not know that there were these two giant land masses that you know today as North America and South America. No idea that any of this existed. So, from that standpoint, he set sail. And in October of 1492, he landed in the modern day Bahamas, the island of San Salvador, and thinking that he had landed in the East Indies somewhere when he encountered some of the native Taino peoples that live there, he referred to them as Indian. Now, we all know the Bahamas is not India, far from it, literally and otherwise. But when Columbus believed he had made it there, he referred to them as Indians. And over the course of decades and decades and centuries, that name stayed. To this day, oftentimes Native Americans are referred to as Indians. And so, from that standpoint, yeah, you're not encountering Indians from India. You're encountering native peoples, first peoples really, from the Americas. But he encountered them, and as Christopher Columbus was often somewhat brutal, oftentimes he encountered them forced to convert, often abused and put to form a system of labor really quickly. Christopher Columbus also was not very kind to some of the people that even worked for him, other Spaniards or Spanish explorers. It's kind of brutal. Now, do I think everything is just terrible? No, I don't, because obviously we have our country as we know it today because of people like Christopher Columbus. So it comes with a mixed bag, but he's not a grand hero that a lot of people think he is. But otherwise, though, he did be the first Western European to encounter what would become the Caribbean and encourage European travel because he realized when he landed in the Bahamas, over time, he realized this is not Asia. This is something else. And maybe this something else is a greater landmass. And he sailed around all throughout the Caribbean, off the coast of South America and otherwise. And he reported back to Spain saying, we did not find India. We found something completely different. And we believe what is completely different is exceptionally valuable. And he was right. So in 1492, that would further kick off European voyages to explore. The Spaniards had massive resources. The Portuguese were largely centered around Africa and going to India. But then the Spaniards would get in the act all throughout the Caribbean, all throughout the modern Gulf. A route, Ferdinand Magellan would sail across and chart the eastern coast of South America and make his way through this strait right here, very cold strait, and these islands separating the South American mainland, and in between the strait, right on throughout here. And that would be known as the Strait of Magellan. And from there, he would sail across the Pacific Ocean. Now, maybe he didn't know that you can go all the way around. You didn't have to go through this strait, but it was what it was at the time. And so Europeans are encountering new lands, new opportunities, and perhaps even new people. And in the North American continent, we discussed those tribes and major civilizations that existed all and throughout. In the Central Valley of Mexico, right here, you had the Aztecs. You have remnants of old Mayan society. You have a bunch of other smaller tribes in either partnership or uh, direct opposition to the Aztecs. And you further go north, you're going to have North American tribes people. And in the South, South America, you're going to have the Inca peoples. Okay. The Spaniards would set up trading posts and pseudo colonies all throughout the Caribbean in the early 1500s. And in 1519, one particular Spanish explorer, Hernán Cortés, encountered the various coasts right here near modern day Veracruz in Mexico, in the Gulf Coast. And as such, he encountered a number of peoples who said that there was a major civilization in the Central Valley of this region. Some of the people were hostile to this major civilization. Others were directly aligned with them. But at some point, many of these people said, this civilization has grand ceremonies. They have this gold that you're looking for. They have all kinds of other things that you would be interested in. Foodstuffs. You talk about food. Well, corn, beans, and squash right over here, bud. The tomato right over here, bud. These spicy peppers. Yeah, all over here. And so Hernán Cortés would make his way eventually to the capital city of Tenochtitlan, where the height of the Aztec Empire was built. Now let's talk about the Aztecs again for a second. The Aztecs were not very kind to people who were not Aztecs. They oftentimes weren't kind to each other. The Aztecs were pretty brutal, and if you came from a rural tribe, you either tried to conquer them or you would kill them and offer them up for human sacrifice. The Aztecs were known for having humanistic rituals to offer to the gods a human, oftentimes somebody captured from a rival tribe. And as such, they would oftentimes cut out their heart while it was still beating and offer it to the gods in a ritualistic ceremony. Spaniards heard about this and thought it was extremely pagan and satanic and deemed these people need to be converted to see the light of Jesus Christ. Okay. So from that standpoint, eventually in 1521, for lack of a better term, the Spaniards had encountered the Aztecs. In an old Aztec belief, Aztecs believed in the god Quetzalcoatl, who was this white angelic figure who looked different than all the natives there and all the other Aztecs. And as such, they would be visited by this god. And it's going to change Aztec history forever. When the Spaniards made their way from Veracruz to modern-day Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, the natives believed that they had been visited by these pasty white Europeans who they thought might just be the god Quetzalcoatl, especially with their ornate steel armament, their weapons, their pasty white skin, and their thick beards and whatnot. Yeah, you're going to look different. Later on, they would invite the Spaniards, oftentimes offering them food served on plates of gold. Okay. A lot of Spaniards reported back to Spain that there is indeed so much gold in this new region that they would be fed food from them and served on a plate of gold that would only be used once. And as word gets back to the folks down in Spain, they're like, oh my God, this is wonderful. Let's send even more people. A lot of that fervor, that gold that you see, that's not actual gold. That's probably the equivalent of a primitive corn tortilla. Given that the Central Valley of Mexico is where corn was established, there's an abundance of it there. That gold plate is really probably just a corn tortilla. And so, from that perspective, you can see how fervor reaches fever pitch when folklore is allowed to explore. It's like playing a game of telephone. You have a line of 20 people, and the first person is told to say one thing and repeat it. By the time you get to the 20th person, that line is completely different and it's said differently. And that's eventually what happens. And so in Spain, they have this idea we need to send more people. In the meantime, the Aztecs eventually realize these are not the Quetzalcoatl type gods that we expected. This is a whole different entity, and they're making various other different demands. Over time, the Aztecs and the Spaniards would come to blows. The Aztecs would eventually drive away the Spaniards, who hid in the hills, and befriended many rival tribes and nations of the Aztecs. There are a lot of natives around who have a massive bone to pick with the Aztecs because maybe one of their family members was abducted and kidnapped and sacrificed to the gods, or maybe they were somehow wronged by the Aztecs. Just because you're tribal doesn't mean you have the same tribal views as that other tribe. Didn't mean you like each other. So the Spaniards had help from some of the other rival tribes in the region. And as they mastered horses that they brought over, they had better armament, they had better technology from a weaponry standpoint, and eventually the Aztecs would be overcome in Tenochtitlan, and the Spaniards would set up shop and claim the Aztec Empire to be the center of the new Spain, Nueva España, where you're going to establish a colonial entity that will spread from the Central Valley of Mexico northward and southward and otherwise to be claimed as Spanish kingdom territory, where you will deem to proselytize to the natives. And you're going to put them into a system called an encomienda, where you are going to Hispanicize the natives. They will be taught Spanish, learn various different Spanish cultures. They'll be taught the not just Spanish language, but they will be taught the religion of the Spaniards, the Catholic Church, and their resources are going to be utilized by way of a system of labor to where we acknowledge you. Now you're just going to be part of the empire. Now you're not going to have a really good status and you're going to be abused quite significantly, perhaps, but you're at least included in the empire. You're a new convert. So what happened now, we should begin a process of conversion. You're not just going to send Spanish settlers, you're also going to send missionaries. You're going to proselytize to these natives. You're going to teach them Spanish. You're going to teach them the ways of Jesus. You're going to put them to work for the good of the empire, to extract more resources, to send back to Spain. That's what the encomienda system was. And also, you're not just going to send stuff like that to and from. There are going to be biological things that are exchanged back and forth from Europe to the Americas and vice versa. So, also going on back at that time in Europe, you had competition for resources. A lot of Europeans struggled to feed themselves. Well, when these European explorers encountered new foodstuffs in the Americas, a significant number of that was brought back to Europe, and it would be utilized to feed starving Europeans. The tomato, the potato, those are going to be brought to Europe. Ireland. There's an old joke that says one of the shortest books in the world is the Irish cookbook. Yes, you'll have the shepherd's pie. You'll have the potatoes and the meat. Yes, you're going to have that. Okay, it's kind of an old joke, but there's a lot of truth to it. The potato, developed in Peru, is now feeding starving Europeans. Mm. So Europeans were also bringing back minerals like gold, silver, ore, by extraction or just by taking it. They're also sometimes taking some of these natives back over to Europe to show them as a process of what's there and how they can be converted. So, on the flip side, Europeans are bringing their language, their religious fervor, their fervor for exploration and dominance in competition with other European entities. They're bringing illnesses like smallpox, for example, to which natives had zero exposure and therefore zero immunity towards. And the Spaniards are also going to bring livestock. Modern day Texas has its ranching culture back from old Spanish colonial days. The Spaniards brought horses, cows, sheep, donkeys, pigs, you name it. Ranching culture comes from the Spaniards, and they brought it to the Americas. Many of the animals also had diseases that would often affect natives in the Americas. So, as part of the Columbian exchange here that you see right here, it's the biological exchange of goods and services and people from Europe to the Americas and backwards and forwards. Europeans are bringing their fervor for religion, they're bringing their language, they're bringing their culture, they're bringing their labor opportunities, they're bringing for exploration, they're bringing livestock, and they're bringing illness to which natives in the Americas have no immunity. On the flip side, from the Americas, you're bringing corn, beans, squash, potatoes, American born foodstuffs that are now going to feed starving Europeans. And it's going to change the trajectory of European history because when you can feed yourself with better, nutritious foods, that's going to drastically improve your quality of life. And that's what happened for Europe. So the Americas fed starving Europeans. To this day, a lot of European cuisine is based upon that. So you look at Italian food, a tomato sauce, a big staple of Italian food. Well, the tomato comes from the Americas. Pasta comes from East Asia. Merged together, they're Italian foods. But otherwise, so American born foodstuffs are going to feed starving Europeans. Additionally, a lot of the explorational findings, gold and silver, would further enrich Europeans tremendously. And you're going to have more and more people who eventually never set foot in the New World who would become exceptionally wealthy as a result. So when the Spaniards were dominant and successful in Tenochtitlan, they would establish their empire of New Spain. Over the course of the next several decades, the Spaniards would lay claim to various areas, including modern day Texas and the modern day American Southwest, in the province of Nueva España, New Spain. They also established Spanish Florida because Florida and its location right here is where the Gulf, the Atlantic, and the Caribbean all come together. And based on this map, whoever controls the Florida Peninsula right here, along with Cuba and the island of Hispaniola, you control access into the Gulf from the Atlantic and Haiti, and also into the Caribbean. So, from that standpoint, Florida would be a very strategically located Spanish territory. We'll talk about that here in a second. They would also explore all throughout the northern coast of South America and all throughout the Pacific coast. Modern day countries like Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, Chile, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, that became other Spanish empires. The Portuguese got on the South American act too. And as the Portuguese and Spaniards are both Catholic entities, ultimately led by the Vatican in Rome, it would also be determined that even though the Spanish and French were rivals from a Catholic perspective, they were equals. Eventually, the Catholic Church would see to it that the Spaniards and the Portuguese would basically split territories in the Americas. The Portuguese were here on the eastern side of South America. On the western and northern side, the Spaniards. So basically, from here to here, you split South America between Spanish colonies and Portuguese kingdoms. The modern country of Brazil was a Portuguese colony for the better part of several hundred years. They speak Portuguese there. They remain very close in ties to the Portuguese. That being said, they're definitely a different entity. But the modern day Brazil, around the Amazon and all the way down south, is directly across from Africa. Hold that thought, but that's another story. So the Spaniards control huge swaths from a territorial and empirical standpoint here in the Americas. This huge swath, modern day Brazil, the Portuguese, later on, other European entities are going to get in the act. But the Spaniards now believe that they're going to have to settle. They want to put the people to work in an encomienda system. It's a form of labor to where you're going to Hispanicize locals, teach them Spanish, teach them to be Catholic, put them to work for the greater good of the empire. You're going to rename them. You're no longer going to have a Native American name. You're going to have a traditional Spanish name. You're going to learn Spanish and otherwise. And you will do your bidding for the Lord and the kingdom. And so Christianity back in Spain, the fervor of the Reconquista to reclaim the Spanish peninsula from the Moors made its way to the Americas. And that very same fervor drove their desire to convert natives to being Catholic. Later on, you have Protestants that would impact European Christianity. We'll talk about that here in just a little bit. But otherwise, though, the Spaniards in Nueva España understood we need to explore north of the Central Valley of Mexico. Let's go into the Sierra Madres. Let's go into what is present day Texas, see what's there, American Southwest, California. We need to see what's there. And when they encountered Texas, they saw, wow, this place here is very, very, very similar to certain parts of Spain where ranching is dominant and highly successful. Maybe we can utilize and bring livestock here to this region where ranching culture can thrive. That's how Texas becomes such a cowboy culture and ranching culture. The Spaniards brought ranching to Texas, as Texas was ideally suited for it. Ah, other areas are a little bit more dry. The American Southwest, it's a bit hit and miss as far as what you can do with cattle there. And so, from that standpoint, you're going to bring different aspects into places like Arizona. But they also didn't just want to find success in north of Mexico. They found it in Peru, the West Indies. It just added further exploration and ideas. And in the early 1500s, as more and more stories of all these plates of gold and other things talked about, the seven cities of Cibola, cities made of gold and whatnot, probably just really wheat or anything else like that, if they even existed at all. But many explorers exploring all and throughout the Gulf Coast, the American Southwest, Texas, you would have quite a number of folks with very interesting stories encountering natives and otherwise. One of the most prominent here in Texas is a gentleman named Cabeza de Vaca. In Spanish, Cabeza de Vaca means cow's head, head of a cow, right? Cabeza de Vaca. But that's an actual Spaniard who was actually captured by some of the local natives along the Texas coast. He was in prison for a few years, escaped, had relations with various Native American women, potentially had kids with them, and he explored all and throughout the American Southwest. And there are all kinds of stories of Spanish explorers doing something very similar. And as such, you develop a conquest. And as people intermix between European, Native American, later on African, you would have new societies of people, new races of people. In Mexico, for example, the majority of Mexicans are a mix between European ancestry and native ancestry, to where the majority of Mexicans are known as what is called mestizo. That means a mix between Amerindian people and European ancestry. I've got a little bit in me as I'm Hispanic. I did a DNA study. I'm like 14% Amerindian. That's pretty typical. Most others have more. But otherwise, though, I'm definitely not pure Spaniard. I'm pretty close, but not quite. My ancestry, my DNA is synonymous with somebody who is an American born Spaniard, basically. Okay. You have new racial groups of people. And Spaniards, when they decide Florida is going to be prominent, they decide to put up a system of missions because they wanted to protect their Florida colony, therefore their access into the Gulf, into the Caribbean and Atlantic. The Spaniards set up in 1565 the first European establishment in what is today North America, okay? Or rather, what is today the United States. St. Augustine, Florida, right here on the Florida Atlantic coast, right about there is where the Spaniards set up this mission right here at St. Augustine to help proselytize the locals, but then also to establish a Spanish fort where you have Spanish military elements that can protect Spanish goods and services across the Spanish Atlantic coast and on into the Gulf and Caribbean. So, St. Augustine, Florida is the first European establishment in what is today the United States. Okay? And so I didn't say British or English or French or whatnot. It's the first European right along the coast. And then as you have other conquests, we talked about Cabeza de Vaca. There's Cortés going from modern day Veracruz into Mexico City. You have Juan de Oñate in the American Southeast. You have Juan Pizarro along the coast of South America here. You have so many Spaniards that go settling in and throughout looking for gold and otherwise. In the American Southwest, right around here, the Rio Grande, as you know, it starts in the Rocky Mountain Range in southern Colorado, makes its way, bisects north or New Mexico, and splits modern boundary between Texas and Mexico, and empties into the Gulf. Now, I grew up near the mouth of the river. The river mouth oftentimes has to be dredged in order for the water to actually make it to the Gulf. That's how much water has been dried from it with all the damming and irrigation over the miles of the river, but that's a whole different story. In the American Southwest, along the banks of the Rio Grande, the Spaniards also inhabit that region. They set up the second European establishment in what would become the United States of America. And that's their establishment at Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is a city that still exists and thrives to this day. Okay? And there were natives there, the Pueblo peoples, who the Spaniards began to proselytize to, who were often resistant to this proselytization, this encomienda, this system of labor, this new language that they had to speak, this new God they had to worship and learn about. They're pretty resistant to that. So oftentimes there were revolts that oftentimes got brutal. Okay? Let's talk about a different European entity. Let's talk about the French. The French, as you know it, wanted in on this North American action. But they had a different idea behind their reasoning and rationale. You see, at that time, fur, animal fur, and fur coats was deemed as being a status symbol. So women who had fur coats were often seen as being women of status. Therefore, men who could obtain one for them are more attractive to these ladies. Imagine how that works, right? The fur trade is very vital to French culture at that time. And it was also a status symbol and an opportunity for men to become more ascendant with ladies, if you will. French explorers would make their way into the valley of the St. Lawrence River, right here in the region that splits the United States and Canada, the modern day province of Quebec, where you have cities like Montreal, Quebec City, later on down towards the Great Lakes. The French would establish colonies and trading routes all throughout the St. Lawrence River, connecting them to the Great Lakes, thereby also connecting them to the Mississippi River Valley. And this region, the French explorers understood, wow, there is an awful lot of fur here that can be trapped and traded. We just don't always know the best ways to look for it. But you know who does? The natives that live here. You know what? Maybe these natives can help us find more fur. And maybe if we pay them, maybe they'll show us where the best fur is. And okay, maybe we're just going to make a great relationship. The French in the St. Lawrence River Valley and the Great Lakes region established a more business approach to Native Americans. They would approach Native Americans and basically say, hey, show us where the fur is, we'll pay you, and we'll also share some of the profits. And if you want to see about our cool religion, maybe learn our cool language, come right on down. But otherwise, don't feel obligated. That sort of partnership was deemed as being much more friendly and more mutually beneficial because it was. It's amazing. You have this idea here, here's what I want. So let me treat this guy like a human being and show him that he can benefit a little bit of it too, whether he thinks he does or not, or whether he actually is or not. He needs to think he is. If it's mutually beneficial, great. We'll both benefit. And let me show you about my co-religion, but otherwise don't worry about it. That was essentially the French approach to colonization in the St. Lawrence River and Great Lakes area, eventually down to the Mississippi River, into the Gulf. The French would establish colonies all along through the St. Lawrence River Valley and in the Great Lakes region. And many of the people that came over were French settlers, establishing French culture, French religion, French language here in this region that is affected by it to this day. French is very widely spoken in this part of Canada. Matter of fact, if you've ever been to Canada, you see a lot of their signs are in both English and in French. We'll talk about how that happens later on. But otherwise, though, this is how the French happens. And so the Quebecois, which is the French Canadian culture in that region of Canada, very prominent, very apparent, very visible, very populous, very influential to this day. This is how they become established. Let's talk about another European entity. These folks are the Dutch. So if you've ever been to the Netherlands or have ever seen the Netherlands on a map, you would know that that is a very small country. And there's a region of the Netherlands named Holland that people often mistake for the Netherlands all in and of itself. It's kind of a complicated story, but it's a little bit different. It's really a region of the Netherlands. The Dutch get in on the action and they make way into what is present day the Hudson River Valley in the modern state of New Mexico. Long Island, pretty much the entirety of the modern state of New Jersey and upstate New York, um, they establish territory. They encounter one small island near the mouth of the Hudson River, separating Long Island from New Jersey, and it would be deemed as an area that would be ripe for settlement because you have natural ports at the mouth of the Hudson River where it comes into contact with the Long Island Sound and the East River and the access to the Atlantic Ocean. You have a naturally occurring harbor there that would be ideal for shipping. And you could send stuff upriver, upstate, inland. There's all kinds of great things that can be found there. And so the Dutch determined this island should be theirs. They purchase the island for the equivalent of $24 from Native Americans, and they would name it Manhattan, also known as Manhattan. You know it today as the epicenter of New York City. So they purchased this from the Native Americans and they established Dutch colony there, all throughout Long Island, upstate New York, along the Hudson River, and pretty much the entirety of New Jersey. There are remnants of old Dutch culture that exist in that region of the US to this day. That's how it happens. And the Dutch also founded the West India Company. They created the colony of New Amsterdam on the island of Manhattan. Um, Spoiler alert, New Amsterdam would become New York. Hold that thought. We'll talk about how it happens in the next chapter. But otherwise, though, you have another European entity, the Spaniards in the American Southwest, the French in the St. Lawrence River Valley, Great Lakes, and Mississippi River, all the way down to the Gulf, the Dutch in a little sliver of modern day New York and New Jersey. There would be other European entities getting in on the action that we will talk about in chapter 2. For now, though, guys, that is chapter 1. This has been part 2. And we will see you hopefully soon. And I hope you're staying safe. Have a great day.